From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Jerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Free Expression from the Wall Street Journal opinion pages. I'm Jerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. If you're not already subscribing, please do subscribe to Free Expression at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you do your podcast listening, and leave me a nice review if you would. It always helps to build our audience. Well, this week, taking a break from the extraordinary pace of international affairs, and we're going to bring it really, really back down to earth, at least as far as I'm concerned. I'm sitting here in Manhattan on Wednesday afternoon, less than 24 hours after we've had something of a political earthquake in the Big Apple. New York City had its primary day yesterday, and Democratic voters, as you will surely know by now, seem to have chosen, it's complicated and I'll explain why in a minute, but seem to have chosen someone who until a few months ago was largely unheard of, Zohran Mamdani, as their candidate for mayor in November's general election. He looks likely to be the Democratic candidate. As I say, New York City has this now rather complicated ranked voting system in which no candidate gets 50% of the vote, of the first choice votes. Other candidates' votes are redistributed, and we will know the result. Apparently that takes about a week to happen. It seems extraordinary to me in a country, in a city where I can order pretty well anything I want, anything in the world, and it arrives in my apartment building in 24 hours. It apparently takes them up to a week to calculate the election results, but that's where we are. Mamdani won about 43% of the vote, of the first choice votes, to Andrew Cuomo, who was his opponent, of course, his principal opponent, widely expected to be the favorite, the former governor, former Clinton administration official, scion of a very famous New York family. His father obviously was governor and once a future president too. Andrew Cuomo was the favorite. He came a distant second and immediately conceded. And there's now a question mark whether about Andrew Cuomo's future. He's talked about the possibility of running as an independent in the general election, although I think that seems increasingly unlikely. So Mamdani it is, Zohran Mamdani. Who is he? He's a 33-year-old. He's an immigrant. He would be the first Muslim mayor of New York if elected. Most importantly, and this is what we're going to talk about in detail, he describes himself as a democratic socialist. He's a far left, can we say, political activist, I have to say, and having seen him on the campaign trail, he's very charming and articulate and quite persuasive. He ran a very effective campaign, I think, as I say, coming from pretty well out of nowhere, campaigning very hard on issues such as prices, rent. New York City obviously is an extraordinarily expensive place, and he ran a campaign promising all kinds of government interventions to reduce prices, including, I kid you not, city-run grocery stores, which supposedly are going to be run presumably as efficiently as most city government activities. Nonetheless, those of a more cynical conservative disposition may think, as I say, he won the votes of very, very large numbers of voters. Turnout on Tuesday was high by primary standards, and so there he is, as I say, very likely Democratic candidate in the general election in November. So what does this mean? There's been a lot of commentary about it already in less than 24 hours. Is this a sharp turn to the left by the Democratic Party? Is it just New York, despite the fact that it sees itself as the center of the world? Its politics are increasingly insular, very, very far left, a Democratic-controlled city. It has been for generations. Does it have any wider significance? What does it tell us about the Democratic Party? And who is this Mamdani himself? And what might he do as mayor of New York? And what does he represent? And more importantly, what do his voters in the Democratic Party represent? This embrace of left-wing ideas. I should also say, and we're going to talk quite a bit about this, he identifies himself as a strongly pro-Palestinian Democrat. He famously called for the globalization of the intifada, as it's called, some time ago, and was asked about that during the campaign and didn't disown it. He said that if Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, who is of course under indictment by the International Criminal Court, if he came to New York, he would try to have him arrested. So he's got what seemed to be pretty anti-Zionist. Some say anti-Semitic. I think that might be perhaps unfair. He's worked to some extent to appeal to Jewish voters, although apparently not very successfully if the polling that we've seen in New York is anything to go by. So here we have this very left-wing candidate, very much in the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez mold, of course, another New York politician, very much on that far left of the party that seems to be, at the moment, having all the momentum in the Democratic Party. So what does it all mean? Well, I'm joined, I'm glad to say this week, by someone who is one of our most insightful and astute observers of urban politics, culture and society, and a friend of the podcast who's been with me before, Heather McDonald. She's the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, contributing editor of the Institute City Journal. She's written very, very widely, multiple best-selling books. She's a fabulous critic, particularly of the kind of left-wing pathologies that infect so many of America's cities. And I say I can't think of a better person to digest this fascinating election result with. And Heather McDonald joins me now. Heather, thanks very much for joining Free Expression.
Great to be with you, Jerry. Thank you.
So, Heather, you and I are both New York voters. We are recording this on Wednesday afternoon, the day after New York City Democratic primary, the shock result, I think, which I talked about in my introduction. This man, Zohran Mamdani, a man who was, I think it's fair to say, literally unheard of outside his own family about a month ago, has won this extraordinary victory in the Democratic primary, beating Andrew Cuomo, the favorite, the former governor, the scion of the great Democratic family. It's being interpreted in all kinds of ways. Some people think we've elected an Islamist. Some people think we've elected a communist. Tell us, first of all, Heather, who is Zohran Mamdani and how he got here?
Well, I feel like we're about to be governed by the student body of Columbia University. And I refer there not primarily to those students' adoration for globalizing the intifada, but rather their appalling ignorance, their juvenile adolescent understanding or misunderstanding of economics and of the basic functions of government. This is a man that has not moved beyond the 14-year-old's view that if we just make everything free and have government run things for us, we'll live in a socialist utopia. And that's not the case. He has very little prominence as a politician. Now, I'm not going to hold that against him. If one believed that there was such a thing as a real expertise in running government, that would also be a count against him. He's been in the assembly for several years now. He's introduced a mere 20 bills and 3 have become law. But frankly, I would rather have somebody without any government experience either who actually had business experience. This is a man who said that his political awakening came when he realized that Israel was an apartheid state. The anti-Israel hatred has been central to his political identity, and he tells us that it was way premature for people that believe in Western civilization, in the primacy of an ordered, lawful society, to declare identity politics and left-wing academic tyranny on our politics over because Trump won. It is still very powerful and can move a lot of voters in the biggest city in the country.
Okay, so let's dig into, again, a little bit into the man himself first. He's 33 years old. He's an immigrant. He's a Muslim. Interesting international background. Grew up in Uganda, born to Indian, that is South Asian Indian parents, an immigrant here, came to study at, I think, Bowdoin College, it is, liberal arts college in Maine. And as you say, quickly established himself as a political activist in all kinds of ways there and came to New York and has been an assemblyman just for the last couple of years. Again, let's sort of go through what we think he stands for. As you say, first of all, he describes himself as a democratic socialist. He's called for all kinds of things. Believe it or not, he wants to raise taxes on New Yorkers. You and I, Heather, know what taxation is already like here in New York. It's one of probably the highest tax jurisdiction in the country. He thinks the next potential mayor of New York thinks that tax is not high enough. He wants to raise taxes more so that New York can provide for things like city-run grocery stores, free childcare, free bus service, things like that. So it's really what we might call sort of good old-fashioned socialism, isn't it? So again, we'll come on to some of the international stuff and in particular his globalizing the intifada later. But as far as we know it, his domestic agenda is higher taxes, higher spending. In New York, where you have so many people who don't actually pay much in the way of tax, and the tax base is so narrow, and the vast proportion of the taxes are paid by, again, a small proportion of the population, this wealthy population, you can kind of see why that appeals, right, to an electorate that most of whom probably aren't paying very much taxes and just think this tax spigot can just be opened up a bit further by taxing the rich even more.
Well, that's absolutely right. And he wants to raise taxes on the rich by another $9 billion. And the view is they'll just endlessly stay around. Now, Michael Bloomberg, our former mayor, did once say that New York is a luxury state. And if you can't afford to live here, too bad for you. So it's becoming polarized between the very wealthy and the people who depend on government largesse for maintaining what is in fact a very decent lifestyle. You know, we always hear about, it's poverty that makes inner city kids go and loot stores and assault people. Social media is the police's best friend because all these kids have smartphones and they're throwing their gang signs and showing off their loot on their Instagram account. That to me tells me that we do not have an actual real grinding poverty problem in this country or in this city. But the idea that the wealthy are not going to notice that the government is taking even more from them in order to waste it. You know, it might be one thing if we actually believed that government could substitute for the market and provide services that markets provide, like food, like fresh food, food on demand through DoorDash and things like that. But we have plenty of evidence. This should no longer be a viable question. Look at any truly socialist state. I'm not a fan of school years abroad. I think they're club meds. American students remain deeply parochial. They go to France and Italy. They don't learn the language. I would be in favor of mandated universal school year abroad if people were sent to North Korea and Havana to see what state subsidized and run grocery stores look like. So we are going to see further residency flight to low-income states that have an appreciation for entrepreneurship. Florida is going to clean up from this. More people are going to be leaving, and you're going to see a degradation further of city services. His philosophy, in a speech recently, he said, a life of dignity should be one that city government guarantees for each and every New Yorker. That does embody a progressive worldview that came into being in the 1930s, that government can take over private functions and do them better. In fact, a life of dignity is something that people earn through their own effort. It is not handed to them. But this is the basic left-wing worldview.
We should note, I want to dig into this a little bit, that for all you've said and for all you and I may shake our heads that people could vote for a candidate like this was no fluke here. There's no sort of flash in the pan. More than 1 million people voted in this primary yesterday, which by New York standards, that's a very significant primary vote. I think the highest primary vote we've had in at least 20 years. We all remember when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez won her primary, unseating a very senior Democrat in the House, Joe Crowley, back in whatever that was, 2016, 2018. She won on a tiny, tiny turnout. I think something like 20,000 votes. More than 1 million people, so more than 400,000 people voted for Mamdani. He didn't sort of sneak in through the back door, as it were. And then if we look, we can dig further and look at his demographic coalition, if you like. It's really fascinating, and his demographic and geographic coalition. I was looking through these details today. He did seem to win a plurality of white voters, in particular, especially the more affluent white voters. He seemed to win among unmarried voters, among the highly educated. And of course, he won significantly among Asian voters. That would be predominantly South Asian, Indian and Pakistani voters. What do you make of the coalition that voted for him, how broad it is, and what does it tell us about what those voters are looking for?
Well, I actually have different numbers, Jerry. I have that Cuomo won in the traditional upper-class white areas of New York City, at least in Manhattan. Cuomo won on the Upper West Side, which is very, very liberal. Now, he didn't win by much. It was 30 for Mamdani and 34% for Cuomo. But on the Upper East Side, it was 29% for Mamdani and 45% for Cuomo. Midtown was, again, Cuomo won big, and a Tribeca, which is about as lefty as you get.
Mamdani's vote seems to have been quite heavy in the boroughs, right? He did particularly well in Queens and Brooklyn, I think. The outer boroughs, I should say, they seem to have been where his support was. And there his support was pretty broad-based, I think.
Broader, that's true. But I would say, again, it's premature to say that the only problem is luxury beliefs for the rich. There still is a lot of energy and gravity in the pull of left-wing and identity politics. I mean, he does identify himself. He said, it's going to be great about me is I'm a Muslim immigrant and a democratic socialist. So that's still an appealing message. But to me, again, it just gets to the basic problem, Jerry, which you write about so well, which is the economic ignorance of a large portion of the American public. And I don't know how one overcomes that, but they still fall for the line that government can do things better. You don't need markets. Capitalism is expropriative and unfair. And that just shows such a fundamental misunderstanding of how the price mechanism works and what has given us prosperity, which has been free market entrepreneurship.
Again, we want to be careful not to extrapolate too much. I've been speaking to some Democrats this morning who point out, New York is very sui generis, very special. We've had different kind of outcomes in other places. Democrats have nominated two pretty moderate candidates, for example, in the two governors' races this year in New Jersey and Virginia. They've, had different results in some other urban places, even a place like San Francisco. So I don't want to get carried away here and think that this represents the New York in any way as representative of the Democratic Party, let alone, God help us, the country. But there does seem to be, doesn't there, Heather? And it's, whether it's Bernie Sanders or AOC or now Mamdani, there seems to be, and again, this is reflected in the polling, a large number of young Americans of all ethnicities, by the way, who describe themselves as favorable to socialism, who actually want socialism. Now, you can either sort of just say, as you and I would say, well, maybe that's just, callow youth and maybe they'll grow up and learn and understand that it doesn't really work. But it does suggest to me that there is something going on here that, again, I've lived in this country for 30 years. I'm an immigrant myself. But 30 years ago, socialism was nobody even thought about, except for a few weird extremists who lived in, places like Vermont and whatever. But it's become more mainstream, hasn't it, within the Democratic Party? And again, we can ascribe that to just lack of education or foolishness or whatever on the part of some of these people. But what is it about this message of democratic socialism that, the likes of Sanders and AOC and this guy are preaching that somehow seems to be appealing to people?
Well, I guess you're asking two questions, why now versus why. The why to me is very obvious. It's a very seductive message that we can get rid of inequality, we can make money not matter, wealth doesn't matter, we can have everybody able to afford everything they could possibly want, that you have an entitlement from the government to a certain standard of living, and we don't need to rely on the messiness of supply and demand. That's an understandably appealing message. It's a utopian ideal. The other question you're asking is why now? Yeah. And I guess I would say it may be that that's always going to be in the background, especially in liberal cities like New York. The question is there other things that are happening that cancel that siren call? And we did have 12 years or 16 years, I now lose track, of extraordinarily enlightened, progressive governance in the sense that it held government accountable. It said we want to pay for results. We're not going to have social services. We throw money at problems without caring what actually happens. And that was under Mayor Rudolph Giuliani and Mayor Mike Bloomberg. But they came in because there was a very critical sense of crisis with the crime out of control. And people, I don't know, there's different sensations of New York. There's people right now, like myself, who are appalled by the squalor in the streets. Just the filth, the breakdown of basic cityscape landscapes, the assaults that are still going on in the subways. And then there's other people who don't seem to notice that very much. If you read only the New York Times, you're going to think that there's nothing wrong with New York because they don't cover the crime. It's an incredible blackout on what the reality is. And for young people that may be partying on the, Lower East Side, they don't have those concerns. And so they're going to be willing to give in to the fact that they feel hip and progressive. I mean, this, you cannot underestimate the desire of people to feel righteous, and the left-wing progressive message is one of moral superiority to those who are more modest in their aspirations for what government can do.
We'll take a quick break there. When we come back, I'll have more with Heather McDonald. We're talking about the shock result in the New York Democratic primary on Tuesday when the far-left candidate, Zohran Mamdani, defeated Andrew Cuomo. And we're going to look in more detail at what it tells us about the state of the Democratic Party and also the state of our cities. Stay with us.
You're listening to Free Expression with Jerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Jerry Baker.
Welcome back. I'm with Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute, one of our most thoughtful commentators on the state of urban America. And we're talking about Tuesday's primary election result in New York City for New York City mayor, in which the left-wing candidate Zohran Mamdani has emerged as almost certainly as the Democratic candidate for November's general election. Heather, I mean, you're a real expert, and you've written just extensively about the challenges of modern urban America and the kind of the various pathologies that our major cities are in. And one of the big factors here clearly in this election, and I will say, again, whatever we think of him, Mamdani was sort of very persuasive, very good speaker, very reminiscent to me of Barack Obama, including in his cadences and all of that, a very smooth performer, very, very, very slick advertising campaigns that he ran in his. So he had a very persuasive message. And I think one of the most persuasive parts of that message was simply the unaffordability of New York for so many people. And you know very, very well that is a phenomenon of New York City. It's a phenomenon of other big cities in this country too. How expensive New York housing is, how expensive it is, how expensive just to live in New York, living costs here, groceries, prices, all this kind of stuff. And he made a big deal of this, and that does seem to resonate. I mean, and again, you and I have the same view about his proposed solutions, including things like, rent freezes, which will, of course, as we know, will only make the matter worse by limiting housing supply. And again, from your perspective as an expert in this, in urban America, there is this sense, isn't there, that these cities are just becoming these increasingly divided between these sort of ultra-rich who can afford to live in the nice parts of a city and everybody else who's just struggling to get by.
Well, that's true because the government is so inefficient. It's so strapped down with regulations. It devotes itself to completely marginal, symbolically valuable activities instead of doing the basic functions of making subways run on time, making the streets clean and safe. And so if you're rich, you can isolate yourself. I mean, Park Avenue still looks pretty good in New York City, but, you don't have to go very far even on the Upper East Side. There's parts of 3rd Avenue in the 90s that look absolutely dreadful. So
I'm looking out right at this very moment, Heather. This is where I am. So, yes, exactly. It's by no means the El Dorado that some people think it is.
No, it breaks my heart. It's incredibly ugly and dirty and broken down. So, yes, that is the case. But again, the issue is, what sort of solution do we take for that? And we need somehow, I don't know how you do this, to bring more to the fore people's sense of how you solve problems. And it's not through more government. Government is the problem. And it used to be, there was a time in the 90s where the understanding was, if you want to help the working class, the way to do that is to focus on the basics of government. Right. Government cannot substitute for families. It cannot substitute for economic effort. Handouts don't give people dignity. Government narrows what it can do to things that the markets cannot do. That is maybe keeping streets clean, certainly public safety. And instead, you have now the opposite reaction from people like Mamdani. And, I've been predicting this for a while. I think the next wave is not going to be necessarily a rehash of the Black Lives Matter racial hysteria. I think it is going to look more like an Occupy Wall Street type of idea that we're going to make war on the rich, and that's going to solve our problems.
Let's talk about the world and foreign policy. It sounds kind of strange to talk about a mayor of a city or a potential mayor of a city having a foreign policy, but this is, of course, New York City, one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world, host to some of the United Nations, and, of course, also host to the largest Jewish population in the world outside Israel. And Mamdani, as we've said already, a Muslim who was an activist when he was at college, I think a very strongly pro-Palestinian organization he was head of at his college, has identified himself very strongly with the Palestinian cause, and during the campaign was quite memorably now asked about a statement he'd made about talking about the campaigning to globalize the intifada, as you've already mentioned, Heather. And instead of in any way sort of disowning that statement, he tried to deflect it and say, no, I'm focused on the issues of New Yorkers. But he has not disowned it. He believes in in globalizing the intifada. He does seem to be a strong pro-Palestinian. What do you make of that? I mean, it seems to fit in very well with all of the things you've been talking about in terms of the views of some of these younger voters. As you said right at the beginning, it's kind of like we're going to be governed by the student body of Columbia University. This does seem to be, along with the kind of embrace of socialism, this fiercely pro-Palestinian, anti-Zionist, some would say anti-Semitic. I must say, Mamdani himself would fiercely object to that. In fact, and he does have, a very good relationship with one of the other candidates who is Jewish and has sort of made a big deal about his outreach to Jewish communities. But this anti-Zionist, pro-Palestinian, globalize the intifada kind of platform does very much seem to be where the left is these days. And we may be about to have as mayor of New York one of their representatives.
Yeah, we may start feeling like London and Britain here. I mean, demographics matter. We have 1 million Muslims in New York. They feel like this may be their moment, but it's also obviously the coalition is much broader. He got very big support in black communities. But yes, this is the identity of the left now. And I always wonder, withered Jews from now on, you would have thought that after October 7th, there wouldn't be a single one voting for Democrats because they should have learned that the intersectional left hates them. You've been supporting civil rights all these years. You've been supporting causes that marginalized, and there are all these groups that you've been aligning with, whether it's fags for Fallenstein, as I saw in Columbia on the day when they broke into Hamilton Hall, or blacks, that they're not your allies any longer. Wake up. And I wonder what's going to happen now. And as you say, Jerry, he doesn't make foreign policy, so these are rhetorical positions, but he does want to somehow, I don't know how he would do this, remove tax exemption for any organizations that he claims have somehow a connection to the settlements, and arrest Netanyahu. I don't know if he could do that if he comes and hand him over to the International Criminal Court as a war criminal, which is absurd. So it should be a wake-up call again. We've been saying this for now 3 years or 2 years. The universities are a disaster, and I'm very unwilling to sign on to all of what Trump is doing. I think he is being far too reckless. He should not give any fodder to the left to pursue their authoritarian charge. Nevertheless, you can criticize his means, but the ends of changing university culture are urgent and overdue, because this is the ideology that's coming out of our universities, and it continues to be fed into our governing institutions, into our media, into corporations. We haven't mentioned Trump, and that's another question one could ask, Jerry. Is this somehow a reaction to Trump as well?
Yeah, well, what do you think of that? Mamdani in his campaign did identify with representatives of illegal immigrant groups, saying he would he opposed the arrest by ICE and detention and the removal of illegal immigrants. How much of a factor do you think, not that specific issue, but the kind of anti-Trump sentiment among Democrats, do you think was involved in this, in Mamdani's win?
I think it definitely has to play a role. We saw the consolidation in Los Angeles around and the grandstanding of Democratic politicians, whether it's California Governor Gavin Newsom or Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass, around, frankly, the rioting in downtown Los Angeles to oppose Trump's placement of National Guard soldiers around federal buildings. Trump was not using military forces to enforce the law. He was merely trying to allow federal agents to work their mission and do what their law allows them to do. But that was a rallying cry. And the idea that Gavin Newsom gave speeches about we're seeing democracy dissolve right in front of our eyes, I think that is a narrative that is coherent to the left, and I think that was part of probably what's going on now. You had the city comptroller in New York, Brad Lander, who came in third, cross-endorsing Mamdani. And some people think that did help him. He recently grandstanded, got himself arrested at an ICE hearing. So these issues are all swirling around, and Cuomo simply wasn't enough of a slap in the face and kick in the teeth to Trump voters. Mamdani clearly was.
I was exchanging messages with a good friend and a good source of mine, a senior Democrat, this morning, who said that, the kind of the internal polling a lot of Democrats have is that Democrats, especially Democratic primary voters, the sort of the more activist types who come out, are angry and they want leadership. And let's be honest, you look at Chuck Schumer or even, Hakeem Jeffries, by the way, worth noting, both of them New Yorkers, of course, the leadership that they've been offering in opposition to Trump has just not been robust enough. They want somebody who's really going to take a stand, be charismatic about it, and Mamdani seems to fit the bill much more than Cuomo did.
Cuomo was actually sort of atavistic in his willingness to speak out on occasion for the police, saying we're going to totally jettison, defund the police. He actually claimed that crime was rising in New York, which is not the case. It's down. But I'm happy to have him maybe acknowledge, and he certainly talked about the mentally ill homeless, that there's still a problem, but those are not the issues that are going to energize people in the Trump era. We definitely are going to want people that are saying they're against any immigration enforcement. Mamdani did talk about defunding the police in 2020 as a route to liberation. He may have not be using that language today, but he is talking about abolishing ICE and, being even more of a sanctuary city. Eric Adams did try to work out some modus operandi that would allow ICE to work in Rikers in the city jails to take illegal alien criminals off the hands of the New York Police Department. That will end overnight if Mamdani is elected, and we will become a haven for illegal alien criminals.
Just in the closing moments, a couple of other questions. I want to go back a little bit on your very interesting point about how you think the kind of the next phase of the resistance, if you like, is going to focus much more on issues of inequality, the kind of Occupy Wall Street vintage of 10, 15 years ago versus the Black Lives Matter, the more on the emphasis on cultural issues. And again, in this context of Democrats trying to stand up to Trump on so many of these cultural issues, all of this looks like a gift to Trump, doesn't it, what the Democrats are doing? Globalize the intifada, opposing the removal of illegal immigrants, creating these sanctuary cities and harboring illegal immigrants, being soft on crime, being soft on prosecution. Trump must just be, and Republicans should, understandably be kind of rubbing their hands in glee. And the trans issue too, I should also say that Mamdani's been proposed spending huge amounts of money to enable more surgery for people who identify as trans. So on all these issues, politically, they're way, way, way from the center. So I do wonder whether this economic issue, where the polling is probably more mixed, maybe that, instead of, while they energize their base with these classic kind of progressive cultural issues which appeal to nobody other than the base, perhaps what is also going on is that there is this attempt, as you say, to maybe refocus issue on economics in a way that, again, even if it means pursuing absurd socialist policies and things that will lead ultimately to disaster, might be more electorally successful. What do you think of that?
One thing we haven't discussed, Jared, that is curious, Cuomo got the union vote. So if that's the case, then you'd think if the left is going to be pro-worker, it would be attracting the union vote. So whether it's just young people that are not in unions that are falling for this siren song of free goodies and expropriation from the wealthy, and that'll take care of all our problems, I don't know. But it is very curious. And yes, unfortunately, we're going to get the virtues of federalism. We're going to have different government models being tried. And part of me says, bring it on. Let's have New York and Los Angeles destroy themselves through these radical anti-capitalist, anti-free market policies and see what happens. I have a personal stake in wanting the SALT deduction to be reinstated. I don't want to pay higher taxes. But at this point, after this vote this morning, my view is no, stick it to the blue states. We shouldn't get any SALT deduction. We should have to pay and suffer the consequences of our own blindly ignorant economic policies.
I 100% agree, both in terms of the personal pain, but also the principled opposition to it. So finally, Heather, I should say, we've spoken about Mamdani all along as though he's just been elected mayor. He hasn't. He's just won the Democratic primary. Now, normally winning the Democratic primary is the same as being elected mayor, one would think, although we've had Republicans and independents in the last 30 years, obviously, too. And yet, it's by no means guaranteed this time. Eric Adams, the incumbent himself, is running rather sort of eccentrically, perhaps as an independent. He, of course, was elected originally as a Democrat, was indicted, prosecuted, did his deal with Donald Trump, and is now, as I say, this rather mercurial kind of eccentric figure, but he's running as independent. He must feel pretty good about what happened last night in New York. Still unclear whether Cuomo has said he might run as independent. It looks like that's off for now. There'll be the usual Republican candidate. Is it a done deal for Mamdani, or do you think we now have a real contest here for the election?
Oh, man, I am a pessimist by nature. Adams got 4% in the primary. That's just pathetic. He's more than half less than Lander got, the city comptroller who cross-endorsed Mamdani. And Cuomo got a lot of funding from the donor class in New York, and it didn't work. So much for the idea that you can buy your way. I mean, we should have learned that lesson long ago. You cannot buy your way into a government position. So Adams would have to make a huge comeback, and certainly the donor class will consolidate over whoever they think is the likeliest to give Mamdani a strong challenge. But it may not matter. I'm not so sure there will be that different in the general election. There's not that many Republicans in the city. Yes, it was about a third of the Democratic voters that turned out. You did say, 1 million voters. That's more than in the past. Still not very many. So what's the condition of those other 2/3? Are they that radically different? Obviously, primaries do bring out the most radical voters, the most committed. But I'm not at this point wildly optimistic, because the city is not in the same crisis it was when it threw aside its decades-long predilection for symbolic leftist politics and elected Giuliani that gave us a transformation. I just don't see a candidate of that skill and charisma to give another upset again to the historical pattern of New York. So the historical pattern has been Democrat, but it has been moving left over the decades, thanks to the academic ideology that we're all suffering from now.
I wish you could have left us on a more optimistic
I'm sorry.
note, Heather. Once again, your insight is invaluable. Appreciate it very much, Heather McDonald, fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Thanks very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
So fun talking with you, Jerry. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. Well, that's all for this week's episode. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. I'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, have a great week and speak to you then.